They were the generations, Brangelina, and a whole lot more. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, a love affair that started with this kiss from the movie Cleopatra and continued through 2 marriages and 2 divorces. Scandals that would have wrecked other relationships, ruined careers. The new book, Furious Love, Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, and the Marriage of the Century, shows the love behind the headlines using rarely seen pictures and love letters given to the authors by Dame Elizabeth herself. And the authors Sam Castor and Nancy Schoenberger join us now. Good morning.
Good morning.
So this is really fascinating. Elizabeth Taylor says this is not an authorized
That's correct.
biography, but she's never really cooperated before, yet she did in this case. Why?
She was afraid that Richard Burton's legacy was being forgotten. And in fact, there was an anecdote where we mentioned we were doing a book about the Elizabeth Taylor-Burton romance, and a young student said, "Oh, I didn't know Elizabeth Taylor was married to Tim Burton." And that story really woke her up.
That changed everything,
yes.
Yeah. That's when she really decided that she would like to help us in telling the story of their love affair.
Now, he did die fairly young, at 58
He was 58 years old. He died in 1984. And
which was the name of the last film he made. He made 1984.
Take us back to that moment Elizabeth was talking about. When they left their respective husbands and wives on the set of Cleopatra, decided to get together, it was the scandal of the decade.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, she was condemned by the Vatican, in the Vatican newspaper, in the Congressional Record. A congresswoman named Iris Blitch, who is famous only for condemning the Burtons, for Elizabeth Taylor, for her relationship with Burton. And it was the most notorious scandal that had ever hit Hollywood, and it was part of the international gossip of its day.
And what did all that condemnation do to the love affair?
Well, for a while, it was too much. I mean, Elizabeth Taylor had just gone through a similar thing when she married Eddie Fisher, and Eddie Fisher left Debbie Reynolds, famously
America's Sweetheart,
right, to marry Elizabeth. She'd been through that. She didn't want to go through it again. And of course, Richard was not faithful, but devoted to his first wife, Sybil, and had 2 young children, and really, was agonized over leaving them. And yet, they were so drawn to each other, they really could not stay apart. So they just rode out the storm, and eventually, soon after first meeting on the set of Cleopatra, they divorced their respective spouses, and 2 years later married, while Richard Burton was appearing in Hamlet on Broadway, in the longest-running Broadway in the history of the American stage.
You draw on this treasure trove of letters, which
Yes.
are passionate, witty, and yet you also see that Richard Burton is a man in many ways, an alcoholic,
Yes.
plagued by self-doubt.
Oh, yes, yes. I mean, Burton, this is part of the reason I think Dame Elizabeth shared these letters with us, and that we're able to share them with the world. They show Burton in all of his passion, his love for Elizabeth, his complexity, his poetic nature. The letters are remarkable, because they also just don't show that this was a notorious romance, but an enduring love affair.
But why couldn't they make it work? They got divorced twice.
Well, I think there were, in a way, there were 2 marriages, George. There was Liz and Dick, the public marriage, the tabloid marriage, and Richard and Elizabeth, these 2 people trying to live together with blended families, working together. They made 11 films together. And they were living in a kind of fishbowl. I mean, as we say in the book, they were, they had to rent, they bought a yacht, famously, because they were too famous to live on land,
You talk about, but you didn't see, or the last letter. The
last letter, she was so generous in allowing us to actually hold in our hands and read these incredibly intimate letters that the world has not seen before now. But she held back the last letter. She told us what was in it, and she described it, but it was so precious to her. And in this letter, Burton finally says, "My home is where you are, and I want to come home." And she has often said of late that she believed that had Richard lived, there would have been a 3rd marriage.
But remember, that letter she received days after Richard Burton's death.
Yes, it was mailed to her just a few days before his sudden death in 1984.
Wow. The book is called Furious Love. Thank you both very much. You can find more rarely seen pictures of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton at abcnews.com/GMA.